All right, welcome to the Using the WordPress Block Editor workshop. I'm Chris Norcross from the Academic Technology Resources Center. And this workshop is, in my opinion, probably the most important workshop of the ones that we're currently offering for WordPress, because really, quite honestly, most of our time in WordPress is going to be spent editing posts and pages, mostly pages, and the block editor is the main thing you'll be working with when you're editing pages. So it's an important one. So let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you that haven't used the block editor yet, or only used to the old editor, that's now called the classic editor. And it is the editor that was essentially around for around 10 years or so. So that's what most of us have worked on. But now they have replaced that over the last couple of years with what they term to be the block editor, which does look very different. It behaves differently. In my opinion, it is better. It is an improvement, but it does take some getting used to. So not everybody has enjoyed the process. There are still a lot of holdouts. I don't mean necessarily at Palomar College, but just in the WordPress world in general, there are people who say they don't like the block editor and are choosing to continue using the classic editor and have essentially sworn to do that. But as I see more and more people go over to use the block editor, and also the block editor itself is getting improved on over as they release new versions of WordPress. I see more and more converts, I think. All right. So I'll be showing off all that stuff, and demoing it all. So I'm just going to kind of hurry through these slides here. So as I said, classic editor is being phased out. So sites are using the block editor by default. The one exception to that is that if you have the site origin page builder on your site, when you go to create a new page or post, it gives you some options. Instead of just defaulting to the block editor, there's additional options that you can choose. And so you may not actually get the block editor by default, but it does allow you to create pages with using the block editor, certainly. You might have to, if you are converting a site origin page builder page to and want to convert to a block editor page, then that may take a little bit of work, but it's doable. So just something to keep in mind. But most sites aren't going to have that as a problem. So it's when you create a page, it's going to be using the block editor by default. And we'll find that if any existing pages where you created them using the classic editor, the WordPress block editor is able to easily convert them in most cases. Again, assuming you're not using the site origin page builder, then it's a little bit trickier, but still not too bad. Okay, I also have a link there to the WordPress Central site. That's just to let you know that we do have resources there available about using the block editor, certainly. And in fact, I'm going to upload to the chat right now a handout called Using the WordPress Block Editor. It's just a copy of these slides that I'm currently going through. And just so you have the link to the WordPress Central site. And then also on the next slide, this is actually the main reason to have the handout is so you have these links here. These are links to all of the articles about the specific blocks I'm going to cover in this particular workshop. For anybody that's signed up and attending the workshop tomorrow, that's called Block Editor Tips and Tricks. I guess I call it Advanced WordPress Block Editor Tips and Tricks. I don't know if I call it advanced, it's more of intermediate, but this is what we got. But anyways, these are the ones I'm covering today. I'll be covering a different set of blocks tomorrow in that other workshop, but these are the ones I consider to be the most important and the most useful, to be quite honest. Okay, so I'm going to leave that up and go ahead and switch over to a WordPress site. So I don't expect you to follow along with me. You're certainly you can just watch and see what I'm doing, and then you can always try it on your site later. I am logged into the training system, and I'll go ahead and post that training system link into the chat because I don't think I provided it anywhere else for this workshop. And if you want to log in there, then it will automatically create a site for you to use for training purposes. Some of you might already have a site on there that you used previously. Just keep in mind that sometimes that content gets deleted and you can't necessarily assume it'll always be available to you. Okay, so I'm going to go into my dashboard. There's a couple different ways of creating a new page or a post, and whether you're using the block editor or not, that doesn't matter. But I want to go to my all pages area. and just show. So this is the primary way that people create pages, and they'll either be using the add new button up here or the add new option over here. You will sometimes, like I said, if you have the site origin page builder installed, that plugin active, you will see additional options here for the add new options. But I don't have that installed on this or activated on this website, so I'm just going to click add new, and that's going to create a new blank page. And when you first go into the block editor, you should see something like this. And actually, the very first time you go in, it will pop up with a little box, basically introducing you to the block editor, giving you some information. I've already canceled that, so it doesn't show up anymore. However, the editor here, whether you're doing a page or a post, and there's actually other types of things that are starting to support the block editor, like the events calendars is more and more starting to support the block editor and look more like this editor here. Either way, though, we want to give the page a title. This has nothing to do with the block editor itself, but just page titles are important, of course. I'm just going to call it my new page. You would, of course, use something more descriptive. And then I can just hit enter to move down to the actual content area. So for those of you that are familiar with the classic editor, right away you're going to see difference in that sense that usually when you're in the editor, you're right away you're seeing all your formatting bar and your editing bar with all the different options, the buttons to change fonts and stuff like that, right? We don't have any of that. Instead, what we have are options to choose a block. So by default, if you don't choose a block, it just considers and assumes you want to do a paragraph of text. So sometimes that's fine. I can just start typing. And as much as I want to type, I can certainly put in there. So a paragraph. Now, if I hit enter, it's going to move me down to the next line here. So I now have a title. I have one block, which is a paragraph, and now I have a second place where I can insert a block. And again, it's defaulting to a paragraph block. So if I go back over here to my slide here, I can see that I have. I'm actually going to copy this just to show you as an example. I won't show it for. Oh, it's weird. It's not letting me click on it. All right, I'll just go there manually. But anyways, this once I show you this first article, you can just kind of get an idea of what the rest of the article is going to look like. So let me go ahead and bring up that one. This is what I wanted here. Okay, so just give an idea of what those look like. They tell you, this has a little video about how to use the block. It shows you the block toolbar you'll have. So you'll notice that when I'm in the paragraph, I do get some options for editing it, not the same as what we're used to in the classic editor. There are some additional options hidden in this drop down here. Some of the less often used items are here. But all the main ones, like making text bold, italic, or linking to text. So if I want to select some text and make a link to some other location, website, whatever, I can certainly do that. There's some alignment options, all this normal stuff you would expect. I also have the option of moving it around. So all that stuff is all covered in here. So I'm not going to cover every little thing about every block I'm going to show today. These articles do a much better job of talking about every little feature that's on there. But what we'll find is there's a lot of things that are common between the block types that I'll be covering, and you'll see how those all work. Okay. All right, so that's the paragraph block, and it's really fairly straightforward, pretty straightforward. Next is the image block. Image block, as you would expect, is for inserting images into your content. So if I wanted to insert an image, there's a couple of ways I can do that. One thing is I could use this plus sign here and insert the image this way. So any block can be selected from the plus. Richard, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so those links that you were showing, that's all provided in that PDF that you provided?
Yeah, the PDF I have is it's an exact copy of these slides. This page is on there. Yeah.
Thank you.
You should be able to just click on them on that. I don't know why it won't let me click on them right now.
Okay, cool.
All right, so we now have insert a new block. It's the image block type. And the image block is really, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to upload a new image or you're going to choose one from your media library. There's also an option to insert from URL. Oh, that's kind of risky because if you insert from URL, then you're basically taking somebody else's image from their site. So that could be, unethical, possibly illegal. But more likely not, you're just taking a chance that if they ever change that file name or move it somewhere else, that's going to break that image. So generally speaking, you're going to want to have an image saved to your computer so you can upload it to the site, or it's already going to be in your media library if it's something you previously uploaded. So when I click on media library, that's the more common option. It's going to show me any images that are in my site. Now, those images could be various file types, JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, PNGs. Those are the most common file types for images on the web, but there could be others. I can select an image, and as I select each one, it on the right-hand side gives me some meta information to it. And also, this one already has the alt text in there, but that's something you'll want to make sure you always insert the alt text when you're inserting images. The alt text is what is essentially what someone who is using a screen reader, for example, if it's reading the web page to them, maybe they're visually impaired, perhaps. Or have some other type of impairment that doesn't allow them to see the page. Or maybe somebody is just at a really slow internet connection, they're in Antarctica or something, and they don't want to use up all their bandwidth by downloading images. So instead of seeing the image, they would see the alt text. So the alt text can be really important. I encourage you to add the alt text in there for any images that are not decorative. If it is a decorative image that you're inserting, there's a checkbox you can check that lets the site know that it's decorative and that it can ignore the fact that there's no alt text in it. Otherwise, it's considered an accessibility error or issue. So in this case, it's not decorative. And I don't know what that particular student is doing in this particular case. Student in chemistry lab is enough for now, but if I knew more, I could say what exactly the student was doing. But now I'm gonna go and just select the image and insert into the page. So now the image is kind of large. It will automatically adapt in size. If I were to save this and preview it, if I'm doing it on different sizes devices, it will adapt. But even on a larger screen, it might be larger than I really want it to be. So I'm going to make that image a bit smaller here. You can see I can always add a caption if I want. That's a great place to add an attribution for the image. Whoever took the photo or who owns the copyright to it, that kind of stuff. I don't use a lot of these features here, but there are options to crop and even add text over the image. It actually will convert it to a different block type if you do that. That gets kind of advanced. You can apply filters to it, but most of the time we're just inserting image, sizing it how we want it. Maybe you have to work, deal with the alignment of it or something. But generally speaking, not a whole lot you need to do. You can also link the image so that when they click on the image, it'll link to somewhere, but by default, it links to the media file, which you may or may not want. Media file means the full size version of it. So a lot of times I will link an image to a particular website, especially if it's like an image is like a logo or something like that. So that's something you might need to do. You can paste in the URL there. It's pretty straightforward there. All right, so that's the image block. Now that I have a couple of block styles there, though, what I can show you is that there's as far as I know, every block on here has these options for moving them up and down. So I can move this image up in the order, which moves it above the paragraph that I had, or I can move it back down. And then the paragraph, I can click on that one and move that one up and down the same way. So pretty easy to do that. There's also something I like to point out is if you have having trouble and you need to get a block in between your existing blocks, like for example, maybe I want to block in between this paragraph and this image. It can be hard to click in between them and figure out how to do that. But it's actually pretty easy. Just select one of the blocks. And if you use what's called the kebab icon over here, you'll have options to insert before or after. So in this case, I can insert after to add a new block in between. So that's kind of a nice, nice little thing to know, because otherwise it can get a little tricky sometimes. All right. And if I just click out of it somewhere, it doesn't harm anything. There's not, if it's just empty, it'll never do anything. I can just hit backspace to remove the blank space, basically. Okay, let's go on and move to the next block type, unless anybody has any questions about either the paragraph or the image block types. They're fairly straightforward, but as you get into using all the different options on them, you can get yourself into some of the more advanced stuff, certainly. Richard, do you have another question?
So would you recommend just kind of playing around with it and then previewing it till it kind of looks right? Because you said that like right now it looks like that, right? But then when you preview it, it might look like a different size or something. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's true. I mean, it'll roughly look the size that you've sized it to, but on different devices it may look differently. So that's where that's where it becomes a little bit. So like, in other words, on a phone, it's obviously going to resize it to be smaller. So no matter how big you make it, if they're viewed on a phone, it's going to squeeze it down to fit. And then so you don't want to necessarily make it too small, so that because you want to look good on the larger screens. But it just depends on where you need it to fit. A lot of times you can just do that visually, and it's no big deal. In tomorrow's workshop, when I get into the more advanced block stuff, I'll show how to create columns. I don't think I intend to cover. Yeah, I don't cover columns in this workshop, but you can create columns. You can insert images into columns to kind of make have two side-by-side ones if you need to, and then get them to line up the same size. So there's a lot of things you can do, but yeah, usually I just recommend just visually just making it the size that looks good for the desktop size when you're editing here, and then just know that it will resize it when on different devices.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next one, which is the heading. Headings are extremely important for a couple of things. One thing is they just visually, they help break up your content. So if you have a lot of content on a page, use headings to break up that content into sections that make sense. But also it's important for accessibility purposes. So you have to, if somebody is not able to see the page, maybe they're using a screen reader, it's much more difficult to quickly scan a page, right? Visually, a page can be scanned pretty quickly looking for what you want. But if you can't do that visually, then it can be much more difficult. So a screen reader will typically essentially jump through the headings to help someone get to where they want to go. And that works visually as well. And like I said, breaking things up for, it works for visual purposes as well, but even more importantly for things like screen readers. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a block here, and I'm gonna choose heading. And the heading text, it's just whatever you want it to be called. I'm just gonna call it my new section. Obviously, you would use something that accurately describes your new section. It will automatically make it the appropriate heading level here for what we're doing. But if you need to change that, you can manually change it. But right now it knows that the title is an H1, that's the highest level heading. So any down here, it's going to make it an H2. I could easily move down and insert another heading. And this heading, I can, I can either keep it a heading 2 like it is now, or I can make it a heading 3, which means it's a subsection of this my new section here of the H2, right? So just make sure you don't skip them is one of the things. You don't want to go from H2 to H4. So like right now, that's an H2 and it jumps to an H4. That actually causes a logical problem in certain cases. So you want to keep them consistent. So this next one should either be an H2 or an H3, depending on whether it's a new subsection or a section of the previous one, subsection of the previous one. So in this case, I'll just keep it a 3 just as an example. So other options you have there, there's not a whole lot. Again, you can control the alignment to a certain extent, but headings don't allow you to do like center and right align. It's just whether the section that it's in, the block it's in, is going to be a full width, which expands beyond the margins. So it's rare that you'd want to do something like that. Wide width makes it slightly wider than the default margins, but the default or none option is usually what you want. And you can do the line center and stuff. So you have to be careful with that with headings. If you line your headings to the right, people may not realize they're headings. I think that's unusual. The center could work if you're consistent with that. how you do it, but left aligned is the default. All right, and then we've got options to make it. I mean, there's the bold and italic options, but honestly, it's already bold, so you shouldn't have to mess with that. You could link it. Headings aren't frequently linked, but they can be. And then there's a whole bunch of other text related options here too, which are, again, are things that are not commonly used. So yeah, you won't have to use these options very often, most likely. There is an option for inline images, which sometimes can be useful. So if you have a paragraph of content, paragraph of text, and you want to have an image that's like embedded inside the paragraph, that's the method you would use instead of inserting an image block. But in my opinion, it's probably better off using an image block and breaking up your paragraph into multiple paragraphs, to be quite honest. Okay, so those are headings. There's really not a ton, to do with the headings. There are some additional options on the right-hand side. On the image, I kind of skipped over some of that stuff. On the right-hand side, it gives you some of the same options we had in the previous screen, along with the width and height options. We can set specific numbers if we need to, but honestly, most of the time you don't need that kind of stuff. With headings, it's a little different. Again, gives some size options, but I would recommend just keeping things at the default. We may actually in the future suppress some of these options because we have kind of specific styles that they default to that we prefer. That go with kind of along with the college's normal styles. So we might turn some of these options off, but for now, technically you could use them. So I could make it all uppercase, for example, or force it to be all lowercase. But the default is just normal case, however you type it in. All right, so that's the headings. Again, easy to use, but very important. So I encourage you to use them. All right, so next we have oh yeah, sure.
I had a follow-up question with the headings part.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is the H1, right? The one that says my new page. That would be
so yeah. Think of it doesn't let you change it or control that, but just think of that as the H1 on the page. Yes.
Okay, so then when I do a new section, it's H2, and then the H3 is a subsection for that. But what if I wanted to create a whole another section that's not a subsection? Would it be another H2?
It'd be another H2, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then so H2 is for like subheadings. Well, headings.
It's just a hierarchy. Right? Yeah. I mean, it's rare that you'll need to go past 3 or 4. Okay. But you could technically. So you could have a sub heading if you really needed to. Okay. That would take you all the way down to like an H5, like say.
Scaffolding list type thing.
Sure. Yeah. But but usually the H2s and H3s are enough. We don't go beyond that too often, but you can. And each time you choose a lower level, it'll be slightly smaller text to the point where it gets honestly a little too small. But
I feel you. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So the next one will be the list block, which is pretty easy just for making lists. Now I want to show you a different way of inserting your blocks. Instead of using the plus option over here, instead I'm just going to do a slash and then type the name of the block. And it does come up with the most popular and or commonly used ones in the list there. But if I just type LIST, you can see it starts filtering the list. There's a lot of them that include the word list. The only one I'm actually interested in here is the list one that's actually called just list. All the other ones get quite a bit more advanced, honestly. So I've now got the list here, which is ready for me to start typing my items. So I'll just call this item 1, item 2, and then item 3. Obviously, you'd have a more meaningful list. You can change the list style. Where am I not seeing that option? Let's see here. Oh, that's it. Okay, so So I failed to realize, and this is something that's again common in the block editor, is differentiating between the items inside the block, so individual items, and then the actual list itself, the entire list. So what I was looking for was this option here to switch between the bulleted or what they call unordered list to an ordered or numbered list. So I can select the whole list and do that. And then Additionally, and there's really not a whole lot, but all the standard options for blocks are there, but there's really not much else. If I go into an individual item, then I do get some additional options. I can indent it, make it a sub item in the list, for example. I can make bold, italic text, link the text, and then of course you get all the normal, more advanced options. You can even insert images, inside each item. So all the normal options we have there, but it does make it pretty easy to manipulate the list there. All right. So as you can see, as we work our way down, I can spend less and less time on each item because the options are very similar. We get the same options for this block of this list block. We have similar item, similar options that we've seen before, right? Okay, so let's go on now. Go on to the next one, which is the classic block, and this is an interesting one. So I definitely want to show you this one. So the classic block is really meant to emulate the classic editor. So some people who have been using the block editor have really just been strictly using the classic block inside the block editor, just because that's how your pages default to if you previously created it, in the classic editor. So what I mean by that is if you had your pages set up originally in the classic editor, and then we turned off the classic editor on you, which at this point pretty much all the sites have had that happen, with the exception of those site origin page builder sites. It will convert it to a classic block inside the block editor. So I'm gonna now save. I'm just gonna hit publish on this page. I haven't actually previewed it for you guys yet, but I'm gonna publish that now so it saves it. And then I'm gonna go back and I want to actually find one of the existing pages that was already on the site, because these existing pages are a good example of what it does. So the sample page, for example, let me go to a different one because that one I was playing around with earlier. I'm gonna go to the copyrights and image usage one. So this page was originally set up in the classic editor. So when it was converted to block editor, what it did is it put everything in what's called a classic block. So all this content here is they aren't blocks. It's just a single block with everything inside it. And it has all the options that I'm used to seeing in the classic editor here. So this should look very familiar to anybody that's used to using the classic editor. Some of you have all been continued using this classic block for everything and been perfectly happy with it. And you certainly can keep doing so. But as time goes on, I think there'll be more and more reasons to break out of the classic block and actually use native blocks inside your content. So one of the things I do here, which is really convenient and works pretty well in my experience, is they give you an option to take this classic block and convert it to individual blocks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the classic block here. I just want to show you how you would use it, but I really don't want to spend too much time because I'm going to encourage you to convert it to blocks. But that being said, when you're in a classic block, you can obviously use all the normal options here. So it's a little bit different how you link to things. If I highlight text, there is a link button here, but it's different, a little bit different than the one that's in the normal block editor area, that we've seen for other blocks, right? The controls, instead of being up here in this toolbar, it has its own built-in toolbar. If I click on an existing link, I can edit that link. Images, if I click on one, it doesn't give me the same options because it's not a block. So I have to hit this little pencil icon to be able to do things like change the image or the size of it or something like that. Add alt text. I can change the image here. So all those options are there in the classic block. But what you're probably going to want to do at some point is convert it to blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And what it's done is it's created essentially a series of blocks using, so we have the page title as normal. We have a paragraph block with all the normal options we expect. We have a list block. We have a heading block, an image block. So you can see this page includes all the things, only the things I've showed you so far on this page, but it converted them all, no problem. So generally speaking, it does a really great job of converting these classic blocks into normal blocks. If you encounter problems while you're doing it, let us know in HRC, but I've yet to see a problem related to that. So it's pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to go switch back over to, I'm just going to not even bother saving the changes, but I want to switch back over to the new page I was creating. And show here, so now that I know what the classic block is, I can go ahead and insert that classic block just to show you how easy it is. I can add my content into it as normal. But like I said, I would encourage you to, instead of just using it, just skip past it and use other block types. Or if it's already has a classic block on your content, consider converting it to blocks. And I don't expect too many issues. So that's an important one that eventually we probably won't even need that classic block anymore once everything's converted over. But that could be literally years down the road before everything's converted. So it's important to know how that one works. And then the next one I'm going to show you is these are a couple, I'd say kind of intermediate ones, this table and the video one. So the table one I'll start out with. The table block, where you add it, just get rid of that classic block so I don't have to worry about it. So I can certainly type the word table in there to get it, but I want to show you one more way of adding blocks. I already showed you can just type it there, and you can use the plus here to choose it from the list here, searching for it there. You can also browse all. I don't normally use this method. For one thing, it shows you so many different block types that are, most of which aren't even useful. We tend to use, most of the ones at the top here, the basic ones. These text ones are pretty useful, a lot of them. Media, but once you start getting down to the design ones, very few of these are very useful. The widget ones, somewhat maybe. And then we get down to the theme ones and the embeds, down here, which most of these you would never ever use. So just a third way of selecting your blocks. In this case, though, we want to insert a table block, so I'll just choose it here. All right, and then once I click off of it, it'll get rid of that panel. Okay, so table block is very bare bones. I actually don't usually recommend using it unless it's a very, very simple table. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I want to point out here is, not all the blocks are great. This one is pretty limited. So I'm just going to say make it 4 columns and add a bunch of rows in and create table. So there's not a whole lot of options here. And one of the biggest things that, that I see as a problem is there's no way to span. I'm assuming they haven't added that capability. There used to not be. Yeah, there's no way to span cells in the table. So that's kind of a problem. So I can't make, more than one cell into like a single cell, which is pretty useful, I think, sometimes. But if you don't need that feature, then this might work for you. There are a few options here, like you can create a header section and a footer section, and then change the text of those labels. You can also make it fixed width. So that's only helpful usually when there's content in it. You can force all the cells to essentially be the same width, or all the columns to be the same width that way, regardless of the content that's in them. Sometimes that's useful, but a lot of times we want it to adapt the width, according to what's in it. So it just depends what you need. There's also, you can make it striped so that instead of showing the lines, it will show gray stripes for what looks like I guess the first and yeah, not, well, it depends if you have a header or not. So the first actual row of data, not the header. So there are some options there that you can use, but otherwise it's pretty basic table. And what I do recommend is that if you have needs for a more advanced table, then you can always contact us in HRC and we can enable or activate the table press plugin, which is a plugin we have available that makes managing more advanced tables much easier. You can make tables with, you can search them and paginate them and all kinds of advanced fancy stuff, more than you'll ever need. But again, this would just be here if you just need a very basic table. Contact us for the table press tool if you need something more advanced. All right, so I'll leave that. That's pretty much all there is about the table. And then now lastly, I'll cover the video block, and then we'll have time left over. I'll be able to take questions and if anybody has anything. So the video block is the first, I guess it's the first embed block we're using. I guess the image one is technically an embed block. But if I go to browse all, where we were before, if I scroll way down to the bottom, there's a whole bunch of things I can embed. And there are different types of, media content. Most of them you'll never use. Some of them I don't even know what they are. But the ones that are, going to be most useful are probably going to be the video related ones, like the YouTube one is, extremely popular. So just as an example, I'm going to go to YouTube and I'm going to search for Palomar College. No idea what I'm going to get. All right, so here's one. This looks like a good one. This is actually official Palomar College page. So I'm going to just copy the URL from the address bar up here. I mean, I think you can do it through the share link here, copy it that way, either way. But then I'm gonna go back to my page and I'm going to insert a YouTube block. And then you see it asks you to enter the URL. So I'm gonna paste in the URL for it and click on embed. And then if I give it a few seconds, it should embed that video. It's gonna give me pretty limited options. There's really no options other than adding a caption, you see. Oops, I'll play it. But it gives me a preview of it at least. And then, that's pretty much it. The video will automatically adjust to the size of whatever's available, the width of whatever's available. So if they're viewed on desktop, it'll be nice and wide. If they're on a mobile device, it'll squeeze it down and everything in between. If you need the video to fit in like a real specific width, then that's when you're gonna have to get a little more advanced and use the columns block. I'm not going to cover the columns block today because I need to save something for my workshop tomorrow, but it's not really that hard to use. You might be able to figure it out. And if you insert multiple columns, you can always stick a video into one of the columns and use that to constrain the width of it if you need to. Now, that's the YouTube one. I could have just as easily embedded many other different types of video content or audio content using these embed options. There's a generic embed one that, if you use it, generally it will pick up what you're trying to do, but the ones that are more specific, if you can, you probably want to use those. Vimeo is pretty common. WordPress, you can actually embed, if someone like a WordPress post or page, you can actually use the WordPress embed option to do it that way, and it makes a nice little embed that way. But you can see there's a lot of other services that you can embed content from. But again, by far the most common one is YouTube. And then after that, it's probably Vimeo. But some social media stuff like Twitter and stuff, I occasionally see used. All right, so that brings me to, that was all the block types that I intended to cover today, so at least specifically. We have, gosh, almost 20 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and hang out and take questions if anybody has them. If not, though, again, thanks for attending, and I'll see you at a future workshop.